well, I mean, this video is going to be like a million years long. So for the record, I'm going to have a whole, I think I'm going to give away this template I work in Logic, a list of all the plugins I use, a list of all the gear that I use in my whole studio. That's going to be in the comments. You can download that, go to that link. I want to get to real deal, like how I mix stuff and keep it as much that as I can, not like what drums and cymbals I'm playing. So just know that's in the description. But what is up, people? So today I want to talk to you about something that I've shied away from making this video for a while. But you all have asked me over and over and over again on YouTube, in the comments, on Instagram, in the comments and the DMs. So it's just time I do it, and it's time that I remove myself from the equation and just make it. So this video will be about mixing and how I record and get my drum sounds. A couple of like disclaimers up front. One, the reason I've taken so long to make this video is because I don't think that I'm like the best mixer person ever. I'm not a mixing engineer. There are real people that have real skills at mixing that get paid to do that, and that's not me. I get paid to track drums, and then depending on the scope of it, program drums and whatever. But when I get paid to do real life recording projects, I get paid to play the drums. And I'll edit my own drums, meaning I'll like beat detective and grid and like whatever. But I do not get paid to mix songs for people, okay? So I'm not a mixing engineer. I'm not claiming to be one. So anyone that's about to watch this who's a real mixing engineer is just going to probably be infuriated by what I have to say. So if that's you, you probably don't want to watch this video, because I'm just a drummer who, because I post video content and I send rough mixes to people and all that stuff, I have worked on my mixing skills. It's a work in progress. I am always continually trying to make my mixes sound better. And I've primarily recorded drums. So I would say that my mixes for drums sound decent, but like everything else, not so much, right? So just know going into it that I don't consider myself a mixing guru or a genius or whatever, but like enough people have asked me that I feel like it's time that I make this video, because I think I have learned so much in the last couple of years, and I feel like I want to pass some of that along to you. So that's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is, regardless of the gear, as far as the drums and the cymbals you're playing, and regardless of the mics, and regardless of the interface, and regardless of all the gear you use, recording, the most important part is how you're playing the drums. Okay, and case in point, if you have a snare drum microphone and you're trying to EQ and compress that snare drum microphone to sound as awesome as you want it to, if in that snare drum microphone you're hearing snare drum equally as loud as you're hearing hi-hat, it's a lost cause. If you don't have isolated sounds at each mic, then it's a lost cause. So you have to play the drums and cymbals with dynamics. That's like the biggest thing on planet Earth, and when you're recording, if you're not doing that, everything else will be impossible. So before you even go in and start mixing and compressing and EQing and all that stuff, before you go into all that stuff, just know that if you're listening to a microphone that's supposed to be just a tom mic, but you're hearing tom and snare almost equally as loud, just know that no matter what you do in the mix process, all of it is made way more difficult because the instrument itself, that rack tom that you're trying to EQ that has snare bleed, and sorry, that's what we call it, bleed. When you have mics that are supposed to record one thing and they're capturing that one thing and something else, that's what we call bleed. So when you have a bunch of bleed, and whether it's snare drum mic and it has a bunch of hi-hat in it, or it's kick drum mic and it has a bunch of everything in it, or it's rack tom and it has a bunch of rack tom and snare drum in it, whatever it is, that bleed makes everything more difficult. So if you're sitting there and you're trying to EQ something and there's a bunch of bleed, just know that your mixes will start to sound better if you start to figure out why that stuff is bleeding and fixing it. That's my soapbox. I'm gonna go sit behind the computer and start walking you through exactly how all this stuff works. As you can see in Logic, and again, I'm gonna keep this as not Logic specific as possible. So the only thing that might be different in Logic as to other things is, as you can see, all of the tracks that I have go to this thing called a summing stack in Logic. Don't worry about that. It's just a group. You can do it in Pro Tools too. It's just a group, so don't worry about it. But what we have here are all of my tracks, and this is every mic that I have. I have a kick mic, a snare top, a snare bottom, rack, floor, hat, room, and then overheads left and right. The only other additional thing is I have a separate track that's EQ'd a little bit differently. I have 2 different snare tunings because I wanted to give you a little more variety. So I have both are split out onto their own track because I EQ'd them and compressed them a little bit differently. But that's that. And if you open up the mixing window in Logic, this is what it all looks like. So it's a little like crazy, but not too crazy. And I'm going to break down. So over here, you can see these are all my tracks, my inputs. So input 1 is kick, input 2 is snare, input 3 is snare bottom, input 4, so on. Those are all my inputs. Those are all the things that I actually tracked. All the drums, all the inputs. Over here, these yellow tracks are buses. And as you can see, these sins, this area right here, all of these are essentially taking the audio that I have, I'm EQing it, I'm doing all that stuff, and then I'm sending it over to these buses. And then these buses do cool stuff that we will get into later. So I'm going to mute that. Actually, I'm not going to mute that. I'm going to just play this down so you can hear what it sounds like. This particular snare drum is like a medium tuned or kind of medium low tuned snare drum. And this is what it sounds like when all the processing is on, all the EQ, all the compression, all the buses, everything is on. And you'll see over here my stereo out is kind of down a little bit. That's just because my interface, I have like 3 computers. It's taking, another reason I haven't done this tutorial is because it takes like 100 computers to make this all happen. So bear with me, but that is tuned a little bit, or that is down a little bit more than it usually would. But don't worry about it. Okay. So here's what it sounds like with everything on, processing, EQ, everything. Okay, cool. Here is what it sounds. So I'm going to take all these buses off because we'll get there. If you're like, what's a bus? Don't worry about it. We'll get there. I'm going to take all of everything off. I'm going to make, actually, I'm going to make this go away because we're not using it. But all of this other stuff, okay. I'm going to go through. I'm going to turn it all off. Okay? Now, I'm going to, no buses. I'm going to play you the raw tracks as they came into the interface. Okay, that's not bad. I'm going to be honest. I'm digging that. And again, that goes back to my point of if you isolate everything and everything that's coming in, raw sounds just absolutely terrible. You know, it's going to be harder to mix and you're going to have to do a lot more work than when you mute everything and you take the raw signal and you isolate it and you say, oh, that sounds pretty good. So now let me go through the drums one by one and let's just hear what each drum sounds like by itself. No processing, no EQ, no nothing. This is the kick. Here's the snare. Notice how it's a little bit of hi-hat, but mostly snare drum. That's important. Sometimes when you listen to the snare mic, it's like all hat. And if you want to know how to get less hi-hat bleed, play the hi-hat quieter. There are a bunch of like tricks and gimmicks you can do, but I find just playing it quieter helps. Snare bottom. rack tom. Oh, we gotta wait for it to come around. Okay. Get you another one. Let's do floor tom. Okay, that's floor tom. Hat. Room mic. And then the overheads. I mean, those overheads sound great. That's really, to me, it's when you listen to isolated overheads, if everything is sounding good, then everything's happy. So now let me walk you through what I do on each track. So I have the raw signal. So what I'll go through and do now is I will EQ and compress each track. And before I do that, I have a couple, you'll notice here and there in places, so you'll notice on the snare bottom and then the overheads, I have this plugin called gain. So what this gain thing is I actually flip the phase. In Pro Tools, there's a different way to flip it, and in Ableton, there's a different way to flip phase than in Logic. But in Logic, you use this plugin called gain, which is in the utility tab, and I flip the phase on these three tracks because they're out of phase. The point is, I flip the phase. Phase is really important. I'm not going to go into that, but if you want to know how to figure out phase and stuff, you can flip phase using the gain utility plugin on in Logic. You just have to pull it up and then hit that little button right there. But phase is really important. So sometimes when stuff sounds bad, it's phase. So you should definitely Google phase and figure that out. So I'm going to turn those on. Okay, now, kick drum. I'll pull up the EQ that I usually use. And so with kick drum, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get some boom, and I'm trying to take away any kind of like mid honkiness, and then I'm trying to find a place at the bottom and at the top of the kick drum. So I'm trying to find a place here. Oh gosh. I'm trying to find a place right around the top end up here and right around the bottom end up here that sings and sounds good, right? So if I play this kick drum, when I turn the EQ on, everything just sounds a little bit fuller and a little beefier. And the main thing that's doing most of this work is this right here. So that scoop right here in the middle is just taking out a bunch of stuff in the mid that is just not what you want. So this is, you just gotta play with it and see what sounds good. But again, with the kick drum, I'm trying to get the mid stuff that's honky out and then find a place at the very top that cuts and is kind of nice and kind of gives it a little bit of spikiness so that you'll hear it when you add everything back in. And then in the lows, I'm trying to find a low note that sings and sounds good. So again, with it, without it. And again, oh, sorry, I'm not soloed. Without it, with it. So there's a little bit of that slap up top. That note is accentuated, and then I took out that mid stuff. So that's the EQ. And then the other thing I do on the kick drum is I compress it. So compression is something, everybody has their own opinions. There's a bunch of stuff you can do with compression. Some people like a lot of compression. Some people like a little bit. I probably like stuff a little more compressed than most people. It adds a little bit of grittiness. I go toward like a darker, grittier type of sound, not the like pristine, super clean, whatever. It's personal preference. And again, I'm not a mixing genius, so give me a break. But so now we're EQ'd on the kick drum, but we haven't compressed it. So without the compressor, this is how it sounds. And then with the compressor, it just adds a little bit of aggression, right? I have this little distortion up. So some of you are looking at this compressor and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. I literally just let it roll, and then I like what I hear, and then I stick with that. So I would caution you to not overthink this. Twist knobs until it sounds good, and then Logic, Pro Tools, everything has presets. Use a preset at first to get you in the ballpark. But then as you tweak stuff, as you learn, save your own presets. Like I have, well, not in here, but every channel strip that I have, that's the whole thing we'll not go into. But this is what the kick drum does. Slow release, but that's the kick drum. So let's move over to the snare. Now the snare is going to be where, the snare has a lot to it. So the complicated part of a snare drum is getting the snappy rimshot type backbeat stuff and the ghost notes and EQing it so that both of those extremes sound cool and they're heard. And same with compression. You want to, when you start compressing, you want to compress it in a way where rim shots and ghost notes sound good and neither start to sound bad because of what you're doing to enhance the other, right? You don't want to get your rim shot sounding awesome and great, but in the process make your ghost notes sound bad and vice versa. So let's hear snare drum all by itself. Pull up this EQ. So in this EQ, basically what I've done is I've added a ton of low end. So if I take that out, okay, so there's a ton of low end, a little bit of high end to have some snap, and then I've taken out something in the middle here. See, that thing in the middle just makes it sound boxy, so I scoop it out. Now some people might so a lot of people talk about subtractive EQ, which when you EQ, you should only take stuff out. I don't know. I've made this bump here, and the low stuff sounds cool. It might look weird, but that's another thing. When you're mixing and all this stuff, you'll look at it and say, that's not right, but if it sounds good, it's right. Don't worry about what it looks like. If it sounds good, I think it's right, and you should go with it. Just because it looks weird doesn't mean anything. But with snare drum, what I usually do is I enhance the low end a little bit. I bring in a little low end. I add a little snappiness at the top end, and there's usually something weird in the mid-range that I scoop out. And then this yellow EQ right here is just a little bit of the stick attack. So this is like the high-end shimmeriness of the snare drum, and this is just like the attack of the stick hitting the head. So that's the EQ for that. And then the compression for the snare drum. The compression is really just grabbing those rim shots and making them pop. And then I'll do another thing with the snare and compress it again, but that's really just grabbing those rim shots and compression them and getting them a little juicier and more edgy. And then this thing is something that Austin Burcham, who does like Study the Greats and stuff, I saw him do a great tutorial on this little, it's a free plugin by Softtube, and it's a saturation knob. But what it does is it emulates analog stuff. So without it, so this is very, very, very subtle. And if you're not listening on great headphones, there's like no way you'll hear this. But it just adds a little bit of warmth and a little bit of tube emulation, and that's something I like. So that's the snare drum. That's the other snare drum. So here, snare bottom. Basically, it's the same deal. I'm EQing it, and in this EQ, I'm taking out all this low stuff, and then I'm just finding where the snare is really just about what is the top missing and how can I add to it, right? So this is really just filling out some of the snappiness that the top snare mic is not catching. So nothing fancy there. And then compression-wise, kind of the same deal as the top head. So the two of them together, so there you go. There's that. All right, let me find a drum fill here. All right, here we'll get the rack tom going. So here, as you can see, this EQ on the rack tom is like a lot of low stuff, scooping out mid stuff, and then adding a little bit of attack up here. Okay, so that's that. And then I have a second EQ that's coming in and doing a little more dirty work and boosting the low. And this is another Slick EQ is another free EQ that you can get. TDR makes it, I think, and it's great. It is also it emulates like a analog EQ type thing, and you only get low, high, and mid, and you get to you pick your frequency range that you want to enhance, and then you gain it up or down. So this adds just a little bit of warmth and a little more body and fullness. That's a little bit thinner, and then when it's on, it beefs it up just a little bit. And then I have a gate on my tom, and so what a gate is a gate. What it's doing now is, so the tom mics are notorious. Every time you hit your kick drum, a tom will ring. It will resonate, and that's not what you want. So you can put a gate on that will only open up that tom mic when the tom is being played, and then it closes. So my threshold and my hold and release. My hold and release are pretty long because I want that tom to, once it opens, close up so it lets the tom fully ring and it doesn't cut the tom off short, right? But yeah. So you can hear, without it, there's a bunch of tom bleed and hi-hat and all that stuff, and then with the gate, it cuts a lot of that stuff out. Floor tom, it's the same exact thing. The EQ might be a little bit different, but again, I'm enhancing the low, I'm scooping out some mid, and I'm finding a place up top to give the drum a little bit of snap. Okay? So those are the toms, the hi-hat, nothing fancy. For the hi-hat, I EQ out. I thin them out a lot. I take out because the hi-hat picks up a lot of stuff. So the hi-hat is like all over the place before you EQ it. And it's harsh. Up here in the high range, it's like harsh. So I darken it up by scooping out a lot of the lows, scooping out this weird mid-range thing, and then finding a place up here. Again, this like 2K, 5K in between there, that's bumped up a little bit to give it the stick a little bit of attack, a little bit of stick hitting cymbal sound. And then there's a little bit of compression on it, actually a good amount of compression on it, to add that aggressiveness, because I like that in my hi-hat. Room mic. So room mic is important. A lot of people skip a room mic and they don't have a room mic. But room mic adds depth to what you're doing. And even if it's not loud, my room mic is rarely ever like up in loud. But room adds so much air and breath and makes stuff sound so much fuller. And for here, what I'm doing is I'm kind of like boosting the lows a little bit, scooping out a bunch of the mids because you can hear my drywall, which is lame. Nicer studios, you don't have to do as much to room mics because they're nicer. So yeah, let me isolate this room mic for you. So raw, this kind of sounds like a boring room. Enhance those lows, scoop out this mid. Now it's just got a little bit of shape to it. And I compress it. You can hear that compressor. It's kind of slammed. And that's giving the low end like a very aggressive boof. Without it, boring, and you can't really, But that low end is now like pretty aggressive, which I like. And then the overheads, remember the phases flipped on those, and then I'm scooping out the lows, boosting the highs. That's it. So without this stuff, they're dark. So this is really adding, because the cymbals go everywhere, right? But this is adding a little bit of presence and a little bit of snappiness to the drums themselves, but is mostly adding that sparkliness that you're missing in all the other mics from the cymbals. So that sounds very dark, very muted. And that clears everything up. So the drums. Now, we've been through everything. Heard them by themselves. So let's hear these drums now. Still, we're not onto the buses yet, but now we have everything EQ'd. We have everything compressed like we want it to. So here are the drums. I'll play the drums without all the processing at first, and then with. So this is raw. Now with. Great. Drums are sounding cool. I mean, I wouldn't mind posting that on Instagram, but we're about to get into the fun stuff. So this first track, this first bus, I'll let you listen to it. Oh, none of my buses are enabled. Okay, so I'm gonna go through and turn all these buses on. And remember, now that we have the signal and everything's EQ'd like we want it, now we're gonna enable these buses, and these buses are gonna send the signal over to these channels over here. So the first one is bus 2 or auxiliary channel 2. So anywhere in these sends, you see this is getting sent to bus 2. This is sitting in, all of these things are getting sent to bus 2, and down here, bus 2. So what bus 2 is like is a squashed track. Okay, so the mix going to bus 2 is all the drums by themselves and then a little bit of overheads. And I scooped snare bottom out of there. It's only sending a little bit. So then what I do is so all the drums, kick, snare, top, a little bit of snare bottom, rack and floor, and then a little bit of the overheads are being sent to this bus. So what I do from there is I just compress the insanity out of it. So that's without compression. I mean, that is adding a lot of aggression. These drums are now very angry. So, again, I'll play this with EQ and compression and then add in this squash track, and I think you'll see the difference it makes. So, these are the drums. So this is also called parallel compression. This is what I'm taking a lot of the channels, sending it to a bus, and then adding more compression and running it in parallel with all those other channels. Parallel compression is very cool. You can do it in a lot of different ways, and it adds so much. It adds so much glue to what you're doing, and you can get crazy with it. So, again, I'll play these drums by themselves so that you can just hear them, and then I'll add in the squash track, and you'll hear how much glue that they provide for the mix. All right, let's hear that again with the compression. So they add glue and they add just aggression and they add just in your faceness. Okay, so the next thing, that's parallel compression, squash track. If you want like a super in-depth thing about that, I'm sure there's a bunch of people that talk about it on YouTube. Maybe I will one day, but this video is going to be like a million years long. So kick sub. I don't have a sub kick mic. You know, there's some people that put like Yamaha makes that drum thing that sits on the front of the drum. I don't have a sub kick mic. So what I do is I actually use a tone generator to beef up my kick. So again, the kick by itself right now sounds like this. Which sounds cool. But so what I do is I send the kick drum over to bus 4, which is this kick sub, and then what I do is I put a tone generator on it. What is a tone generator? Well, it literally is this tone generator is generating a sine wave at 45 hertz. So by itself, this tone generator sounds like okay, so that's a tone generator. Not totally useful unless it's also used with a gate. So what this gate is doing is this gate is side chained to the kick drum. So this gets complicated, and like again, I barely understand this stuff. So for me to explain it to you is like impossible. But and it's not impossible because you're not smart enough. It's impossible because I'm not smart enough to convey this information to you. But I'm gonna try. So this tone generator, what it does is when the kick drum sends signal from this bus over here over to the channel that this tone generator is on, allows this gate to open up and then close. But this gate, what this gate is doing is because this tone generator, without this gate on, the tone generator just exists and it's just on forever. So you put this gate on, and this gate is saying, okay, nothing's going to make noise on this channel unless it gets input from the kick drum channel. So every time the kick drums hit, it allows this gate to open up and make noise. And what the noise is, what it's doing is it's letting this tone generator come through. Okay, so like side chaining, all that stuff is really complicated. But this is a huge secret, because now, without this sub kick channel, the kick drum again sounds like this. But with this tone generator, it sounds a lot beefier. Okay, so it's adding a lot of beefiness, a lot of fatness, a lot of just insanity in there. Very cool. And what I do is I like duck that. Basically, you put enough in there to notice it, but not anymore. So that's the sub kick. And then what I do is I take the toms, the rack and floor tom, and I send them to a channel where I compress them. I send both of them to a channel where I compress them, put another EQ on it to fatten them up even a little bit more, and then I put a gate on them so that, again, I cut on all the bleeding that comes through. But so this is the bust tom channel. So you only hear the toms, and they're super fat. And then you only hear toms. So that's super cool. It takes a while to find the gate to where it opens up when it's supposed to, but not more than it's supposed to, and all that stuff. But that's the tom channel. Here, I'm compressing the snare again. I'm just taking the snare top and the snare bottom, sending it to its own track. So this is just the two snares together. So I'm compressing the snares again, cool. I'm doing that saturation knob again, cool. And then the only other thing is I have this app called Transient. So Audio Assault makes it, and it just adds a little bit of like, just adds a little bit of like punch, and like it enhances the transient. So then the other thing that I have going on here is this very last track, which is the kick attack. And what this kick attack is I'm compressing so I take the kick drum that I played and that sub kick that I have, and I bust them both to this channel, and then I compress them together. I have an EQ that is like an insane EQ. It is adding a ton of high end and a ton of like upper, like mid stuff. And then I'm taking that transient thing, doing that, and then I'm taking this saturation knob and I'm saturating a little bit. Basically what this is doing is it's taking the kick drum, compressing it, and then adding a lot of snap and attack. And this channel exists because of iPhones. So when I post something to Instagram or YouTube, I know that unless I go out of my way to make the kick super punchy and snappy, no one will hear the kick drum ever, because everyone's listening on phones. So this channel by itself, before I do any of the processing, is just remember, it's the kick and the sub kick together. So it just sounds like the kick drum. Then I add a little bit of compression. I add that EQ, which is crazy, thins it out, but adds a lot of snappiness. Transient, which adds a lot of punch and makes it snap even more. And then that saturation knob almost makes it like clip. But what that does, actually, let me mute these again, is when you're playing this whole mix, it adds a lot of high-end snap that the kick drum is missing without it. And that's really it. So everything all together, all the buses, all the EQs, all the process, everything. And what I'll do is I'll go through, I'll turn all this off, and I'll mute these. And you'll hear the drums again raw. And let's hear this other snare drum. So this other snare drum is a little bit of a gushy snare drum, and I love it. Not bad. But I add in these buses, add in this stuff, go over here, add in all these synths, add in all the effects, and what you're left with. So that's it. I know that's a super quick overview, and if you have more specific questions, shoot me an email, timbuellmusic@gmail.com, or put it down in the comments. But that's really how I do it, and it's a lot of experimentation. And now that all of this is set, I'm going to have this. You can download it. If you use Logic, you can download this template that I have, and you can play around with this. I don't care. Go ahead, do it. Check it out. You might want to track down some of these plugins like the TDR and the saturation hub and all that stuff, but maybe I'll have links for that. I don't know how ambitious I'll be. But if not, they're all free and you can download them. Other than that, it's all stock Logic plugins. But I would aim at trying to set up, you see here, you can go to save channel strip setting. Once you find a setting that works, you're like, man, this is a great mix. My snare drum sounds awesome. Save it as a channel strip setting. What that'll allow you to do is when you have a gushy snare drum, you can save a gushy snare drum setting. And when you have a medium tuned snare drum, you can save a medium tuned snare drum setting. And you can refer to those and pull those up super quick. That's going to make mixing a lot easier. But yeah, this is it. Download this template so you can mess around with it. Check out the gear list, all of that stuff. That is how I mix stuff. I hope you enjoyed it. And again, if you disagree with me, that's totally cool. I would love, actually, if you have suggestions of, hey, you should try this thing out or try this technique out. I would love that. But again, this is not because I think that I'm an amazing mixing person. So, you trolls, stay at home. But seriously, I want to connect with you all about this. If you found this helpful or if you have more questions or whatever, put them in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.